Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be with you here today. As usual, I'd like to know if you're here. So if you would let me know by putting your name and where you're from in the comments, I'll check in occasionally and see if you have thoughts or questions. And even if I don't get to those, I will check it later. I'll go through and read all the comments. And if there's something specific to you, I'll try to answer. But today, what you've signed up for is what I'm calling the culture of avoidance, how to stop the disconnects, blind spots, and red flags. So I'm going to ask the question. I'll start out by saying, what is the difference between a culture of accountability and a culture of avoidance? And the difference is that a culture of accountability is actually by design, and a culture of avoidance is by default. So in today's office hours, what I'm going to do is help you to be able to spot those the disconnects, the blind spots, and the red flags. Because, as Dr. Phil says, you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. And so, if you don't know these things exist, you're the fish in the water. You really don't know how to spot what's going on. So my hope is that I'll help you to spot what's going on and then tell you some things I'm going to be doing in 2025. And I'm going to check in real quick. I see Leanne from Missouri, Erica from North Carolina, um, from Washington University, Teresa, David from Orlando, and Mark Crisenberry, someone I've met before. So I'm so glad you're here. So let's just go ahead and dig right in. I'll keep checking in. This all started, I've been at this for a while, for those of you that have followed me and know my journey. And today I actually posted on my thread the beginning of my journey, if you're interested. But midway through this journey, I started to notice something, that every big problem, and I don't mean small problems, small conflicts, every big problem in an organization could actually be traced back to a conversation that should have happened but didn't. So think about that for a moment. And when you look at issues that make national news in organizations and so on, just start tracing it back and you'll see that there were conversations that were avoided. Now that you know that, it's easy to understand that when we avoid conversations, there's a ripple effect, there's a domino effect. Earlier this year, I put together a survey. It's on the front page of my website. If you want to take it, it's simple. It will put you on a list, but I'm not blasting out information to that list. But the survey is called Culture of Avoidance Assessment. And it's just asking certain questions to give you insights to whether you are working in, or if you're leading in an organization where there's a culture of avoidance. What's interesting about this is that I didn't designate this assessment just for top level leaders. So there's all kinds of leaders at different levels that have taken this assessment. That's giving me a lot of inside information. So I want to share some of that with you right now. Here's some of the trending issues. One is that there's overwhelmed executives that lack confidence in their management team. They're very disappointed because they don't feel like things are getting handled, and they feel like they're having to fix problems uh, at the mid level and top mid level that they shouldn't have to. The number two is really one of my favorites because I see it a lot, and that is when there's a problem, instead of having conversations because the problem has gone on for too long, they rely on policy. So they say, we need to create a new policy. But the truth is, if you create a new policy, but already there's the inability to have conversations to make the policy stick, then the policy itself is actually causing more trouble than if you didn't have it at all. And of course, I would say most of you understand this, that mid-level leaders often feel very much stuck in the middle. And I want to say, like, number seven, supervisors or managers who are just too nice. And I talk about that in my book, From Conflict to Courage, that when you get promoted and you don't have training, you don't have support, you don't have mentoring, there's no onboarding, either leaders become way too nice or they become my way or the highway because they simply don't have the awareness and the skills. So what are the disconnects? That's what we're going to talk about. What are the disconnects? And I have four that I want to bring forward today. And I ask you just to think about this as it applies to your work and your own organization. So the first disconnect is the disconnect between the layers of leadership. The very frontline supervisors have absolutely no idea what the executives, what the vice presidents, what the C-suite, what they're thinking about. They really don't understand how the work they do relates to the top level. And at the same time, the top level doesn't really understand the problems that mid managers are facing, why there's turnover, why there's the problems in the organization, that they don't really know why. And they're trying to come up with kind of fancy solutions sometimes. So, what I did here is I created a little grid where you can see a snapshot of how I'm observing the different layers of leadership and their points of view. So obviously, the C-suite is looking at strategy, profits, vision. That's what they're doing. They're always looking at the bigger picture. They're busy trying to sustain the organization and build it up. The director level, and of course, there's layers perhaps between these layers, or they might be called something different in your organization. So you have to do a little bit of creative imagination to make this work for your particular organization. But the director level, they've gotten to where they are because they were good at what they did, and excellent performer. But the problem is they don't want to mentor down a little bit. They have this feeling. I've seen this in my consulting. They're saying is, I shouldn't have to babysit. I've got managers, and why am I having to babysit? So that mindset is creating some problems. Then the manager in their position, they've elevated from supervisor to manager, and they really don't want to look incompetent. They understand what's expected. They sometimes just don't know how to overcome some of the barriers. So they don't want to look incompetent. That's their big fear. The front level supervisor, the brand new leader, whatever that title might be, they're really kind of asking themselves, who am I as a leader? I mean, what am I supposed to do? Am I going to be supported? If I make people mad and they quit, like, am I going to be backed up? So they're really having an identity crisis of who am I as a leader? And possibly because there was no onboarding, there's no mentoring, and there's a real paradox with this frontline level. The paradox is that leadership training before you become a leader, it's really difficult because it's not really that relevant. You always think, oh, I'm going to do a good job and people like me and I have integrity. Then the problems start, and that's when it becomes super interesting to have leadership development. So it's a real weird situation when you haven't been a leader before and now you are a leader. You kind of don't know what you need until you get into that position. So that's one of the challenges organizationally. And so here's what I see as the missed opportunities. The C-suite, what they miss is the opportunity to model and support what they say they want, the values on the wall, the mission, the vision. If the C-suite have behavioral issues to where they're not emotionally supportive to their other leaders, if they're so hard driving that it's all about results, results, and I see you as a cog in a wheel. If they don't understand that their behavior is what's driving the culture, they miss the opportunity to model and support the very things they say they want their other leaders to do. The director, what they don't realize is that if they've really gained those skills in management and then they elevated to director, the real opportunity is to become a coach, to mentor, to give feedback, not to do the job for the mid-level, but to actually support them in their own knowledge and abilities. And I can tell you there's nothing more fun than teaching other people something that you've learned. So to me, that's such a gift if you've elevated to just see yourself differently instead of I'm driving it up forward to become a vice president. You'll be such a better leader if you're a director and you learn how to coach and mentor instead of just critique and give yearly feedback. Then for the manager that says, I don't want to look incompetent, here's where the missed opportunity is to share those problems with the director. As I said, though, if the director comes from mindset of, I hired you to know this, or I shouldn't have to babysit, that's where the division comes in and there's no real conversations because those conversations don't feel good. And we humans don't like things that don't feel good. So there's the opportunity. And with a supervisor, the opportunity is to start developing a leadership identity with or without support from the organization. So I'm not someone that believes that the organization has to do everything. I think we have to take personal responsibility. There's plenty of ways to start learning about leadership, from reading books to asking for mentoring to joining small groups where you can learn a little bit as you go. Because if it's left up to you, you're still you and you still want to grow. So if your organization doesn't offer that, figure out how you can develop an identity as a leader instead of a best friend or instead of a persecutor that's just trying to get people in trouble. So here's the red flags. New leaders overestimate their abilities. A long time ago, well, not really that long ago, but several years ago, I did a lot of surveys. I was traveling around and doing at frontline mid-level leadership, and I would do a survey and I would ask a question: how long have you been here as a leader? And it was, 1 year or less a lot of times. And I would ask about their confidence and their ability to have difficult conversations to get results. And what surprised me was that the leaders that had been there a year or less gave themselves nines and tens, and leaders that had been in mid management and beyond gave themselves fives and sixes. So this tells me that you don't know what you don't know, and you can think you're really good at something, but you haven't had enough experience to know. So new leaders always overestimate their abilities. Mid-level leaders keep problems from their boss. Higher level feels blindsided, and then it goes from micromanagement to completely hands off to try to solve the problem. And this is just a fear-based reaction. So I have this picture here, and one is just on the left is the upper level, maybe one level up from you. Then on the right is the front line, or the first line managers. There's a lot of balls being dropped. There's a lot of blind sides. And one of my philosophies, and one of the reasons I believe in having conversations even when they're difficult, is that there's nothing worse than being blindsided. I don't think as an employee or as a frontline, midline, director level leader, you should blindside anybody. And I believe employees should not blindside their boss, and I believe that bosses should not blindside their employees. When you really address this and agree with this, there's going to be a lot more trust, because if even if we have a hard conversation, if you know that I would never blindside you, then you might be angry, but you will trust me. And the same goes upwards and downwards. So let's look at number 2, the disconnects and definitions. I'm going to check in real quick. Hey, Gerald says, excellent analysis of trending issues. Amanda Potter, hey, good to see you. And Madeline, don't know what, UAE, Madeline, nice to have you all. So let's look at number 2, the disconnect of definitions. So there's a difference between conflict avoidance, conflict management, and conflict resolution. Conflict avoidance, in my book, I talk about avoidance, appeasing, and aggression, the 3 A's. It's all avoidance, the ways that we cope with avoiding difficult conversations or difficult situations. Then there's conflict management. Conflict management is when we're addressing the issues. Conflict resolution is the result of conflict management. We have clarity, we have agreement, we have peace. Unfortunately, too often we try to get through to conflict resolution through conflict avoidance. You can't get to peace through conflict avoidance. Eventually, there will be a ripple effect. So I want you to see that what's standing in the way between resolution and avoidance is conflict management. That's where we have to learn how to manage instead of mismanage conflict. You'll see that I have arrows going one to the right, one to the left. When I started this work on conflict resolution, conflict management, I realized that we all have different definitions for conflict, and that if we would change the definition, it would change our interpretation. So rather than seeing conflict as a fight, an argument, a win-lose situation, we see it as opposing drives, desires, and demands. And once we start to really, really, really identify conflict as opposing drives, desires, and demands, what happens is natural curiosity. I want to know why you see things the way you do. I want to know what's driving that. I want to know what demands that I may not be aware of. And once you get curious, you open up a conversation. When you need to win, you close down the conversation. So when you start to see conflict differently through your language, it starts to shift. Here's the red flags. Making new policies to try to mitigate conflict. I've already talked about that. Another one I see a lot is, let's do a reorganization. There's a couple of people that don't get along, and sometimes reorganization is good because it's not using the person's talents and unique capabilities, but very often reorganization is used to avoid a deeper conversation. And then there's often, to me as a consultant, I can share this with you. Honestly, there's a focus on solutions before defining the root problem. How I know this is happening is if there's a problem, there's a small budget, and they've already figured out that it's a workshop and 2 coaching sessions. Those 2 things may be involved and maybe not. Sometimes it's not about the mid managers like you think it is. Sometimes it's higher up, and many times it is because the top leader drives the culture. but we often want to give this workshop to frontline level, or we want to do a performance improvement plan with someone, and very often it's systemic. So there's very many misunderstandings and misinterpretations. And I want to see if there's any, is there any comments here? I'm looking and I'm not seeing any questions. As I said, I'll post later. I definitely want to give you this really quick. There's a learning guide that has this today. All of this in order. So if you want to grab that, you go to marlenechism.com/office hours. When you sign up for it, it's going to give it to you by email. So don't expect it to pop up right then. It's going to send you an email. So check your spam filters. If you want to, you can watch this later with some different levels of leadership and use this as a lunch and learn. So number 3 is a disconnect between the values and behavior. And as you can see, I have a little image of a human being, and they're saying safety first, and yet they've got their arm in a sling and their eye has an eye patch. I do this as a joke to say that very often values and priorities will become opposing drives, desires, and demands. Sometimes we want safety, but we also want productivity. And I'm mentioning this from my days of working in manufacturing. It was a great place to work for where I was at that time. They really had a high value on safety, but they also had a priority on productivity and making that money. And any of you that work in a manufacturing situation, you know that it's all about OSHA and no lost time accidents. And, you have to learn all these things. You have to wear protective eye equipment, earplugs, be careful, stay out of the way of forklifts, and so on. And very often we would get to celebrate 1 million man hours, no lost time accidents. And I used to jokingly say when they would celebrate this and take a picture in the newsletter, there would be someone with a sling, someone with an eye patch, and someone in a wheelchair. Because what they would do sometimes is that they would, well, yeah, you had an accident, but we're going to put you in the nurse's station counting paper clips, and we're going to pay you because there was no lost time. So I just want to say we're all pretty wise to that. We cheat a little bit sometimes. That's pretty normal. But sometimes our values and our behaviors, they clash. And here's an example. This was an organization where I got a phone call, and almost all healthcare organizations, they have very similar values: dignity, compassion. Compassion is almost in every single hospital or healthcare organization as part of their values. But I got a phone call, and what I heard was from the top leader that I was talking with, that there was a lot of turnover at the frontline level, which is housekeeping and putting supplies out and so on. A lot of problems with keeping people there, keeping them employed. A lot of fighting, a lot of gossiping, and so I said, well, let me just back up for a moment. I said, what are some of your top values? I always want to know that. Well, it's compassion. It's all about compassion. Well, come to find out, people on the front level were making fun of new people that would come in and make fun of their figure, their accent, and so on. It was pretty cutthroat and very much a lack of development at that front line where the values were not being expressed. Because the truth is, if the employees are treating each other disrespectfully, it's very likely that they're treating patients disrespectfully on up the line. You can see the signs at any level of leadership where the values aren't aligning. And I often hear, where there's a bully on board, well, there's nothing I can do. They're a top performer. So I often say that if behavior is not part of performance, that's where the problem is. So if you've got someone that's great at what they do, but they can't get along with their team members, start to look at turnover, start to look at the cost associated with that person always being the star. Sometimes also when someone gets promoted to a higher level and they were a great performer, but they become a leader, they're not used to not having that spotlight. Now it's about stepping aside, putting the spotlight and the support on other people. So we sometimes talk about being a great performer and we haven't fully defined that like we need to. And here's another one. This one got about 400 likes and 50 shares when I put this little post up a few weeks ago. There's nothing I can do. They've been so loyal to the organization. I'm going to make some people mad here, but I see this in a lot of government type entities where it's all about how long they've been there. And it doesn't matter if they quit performing 10 years ago, they've been here 25 years. And so we're going to give them, we can score people on their performance reviews, which I don't think should be once a year. I don't even know if I believe in performance reviews, because I believe if you have conversations when you need to, you probably, everybody wins and you don't need to, but that's another program. What I would notice is that someone that's been there a long time might get their performance review and get a 2.5, which is acceptable. The great performers get a 3. No one gets anything more because there's no budget. So can you understand how this demotivates the good performers, the ones that are really working overtime, making it happen, and the ones that are working the system, taking off, they're getting by with it. So a lot of people, managers, leaders, frontline, shared this post because we're all experiencing this. Here's the red flags. When the high performer is a bully, when the poor performer is rewarded because of tenure, seniority, when long-term problems go unresolved. It's been this way for 5 years. It's been this way for 3 years. Competing values or priorities, when we're not clear that that's what's happening, those are the red flags. So number 4, and the final one, is the disconnect about conflict and culture. I'm going to give you that learning guide once again. Let's see. Here we go. Can you see that? There it is. There it is right there. So if you want to go grab that, just take a snapshot of the screen, go get that later. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about number 4, the disconnect about conflict and culture. So I often ask this question, what is unresolved conflict costing the organization? What is unresolved conflict? And I spoke to this just a little bit. I talked about how if there's a bully on board, maybe other people are quitting. Maybe other people aren't doing their work because they don't want to be criticized. We have to start understanding not just someone's great performance, not just the numbers, but the relationships. Who's jumping overboard? Where's the leak in the boat? Where's the turnover? If you can start thinking that way, then you start tying relationships and behavior as well as high performance. Sometimes people need to work on their actual technical skills, and sometimes people need to work on their inner game, their personality, their ability to deal with others, their lack of patience. We just have to determine where someone wants to grow. And if they don't want to grow, then maybe that is a reorganization where someone just works by themselves. There's nothing wrong with that. But you have to understand that if the system isn't working for everyone, then it probably is working for no one. I want to say this too, underestimating the personal cost of mismanaged conflict. A while back, I wrote an article on my LinkedIn newsletter, and the title of it was Conflict Costs Nothing. The reason I put that title there is because when you look at Gallup studies, when you look at any kind of study that's out there, it's always talking about the number of hours spent arguing, and conflict is costing. I don't think most of us are buying into that so much, because maybe that argument made us save the day and we did something about the problem. Maybe that argument was just a disagreement and then we resolved a conflict. So to say that an argument or a disagreement or conflict is costly, I'm not sure that it is. I think conflict can help you determine your real desires, can help you to set boundaries, can help you to see contrast. Conflict itself is not the problem. The problem is mismanagement. And we don't often talk about the personal cost of mismanagement. We talk about mismanagement and turnover. I enjoy that kind of research too. But what's even more important to me, because life is so short, why would you want to work in an environment where there's constant turmoil and drama? Why would you? What is the purpose? We don't know how long we're here. Why not work somewhere where you feel enjoyment, where you're building your skills, where you're building relationships, where you enjoy using your talents? What is the mismanagement costing you personally? Well, it's costing you mentally, it's costing you emotionally, it's costing you spiritually, and it may be costing you physically. So mentally, you're just tired of that hamster wheel of back and forth with someone. And as a leader, am I making the right decision? Am I going to be supported? Like, it's costing you. Your prefrontal cortex is exhausted and worn out from trying to make decisions. And then emotionally, you're exhausted, you're tired, you're staying up late to watch Netflix, you don't know how to manage your time. because emotionally, it's never ending. It's a never ending emotional treadmill. Spiritually, you just know there's something more. There's something inside all of us that we know when there's more and we know when we're not living it. And then physically, sometimes our body will just shut us down because we're not taking those breaks. We're not addressing issues. We're not moving on. So I just want you to really know that no matter what organization you're in, if there's unmanaged conflict or mismanaged conflict, it is costing you personally, regardless of whether they connect the dots of how it's affecting the organization. I see this a lot too. This is that checklist mentality of we did the program, we did the DISC survey, we did the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Why didn't it work? Well, it's single faceted. It's about the checklist. It's about getting it done versus what do we really need. It can be so much simpler than we make it. There's some unrealistic expectations from a one and done workshop or a once a year training hosted by human resources or internal HR development. I mean, not to discount that, it's valuable, but sometimes those ones and dones are just checklist, very generic training with low substance, and there's lack of sustainability because we don't know how to keep it going. And sometimes it's just a cultural misfit. We had the program, didn't really do any good. The senior leaders aren't living it, so why should we pay that much attention? It's flavor of the week. So we have to really look at our training and what we're doing, and is it working? Is it giving us what we need? Not did we do it? So here's the red flags. Too many issues are going straight to HR. If issues are going straight to HR, it means mid-level managers don't know how to lead. They don't know how to have conversations to get results. And finally, it goes to HR, and everything is dumped on HR. Culture work, leading, managing, having conversations, it's dumped in HR's lap with all the other things they have to do regarding strategy, and they get off track trying to solve these kind of problems. The personal improvement plan is viewed as the door to termination. Most of the time when people get those kinds of plans, it's because the conversations haven't been had or they're not working or that person that's mentoring them doesn't know how to identify what the real problem is. There may be conversations, but there's no accountability. So I see that lack of accountability on the follow through. I talk to them 1,000 times, nothing's working. I see that quite a bit. Or again, when the top level isn't walking the talk, there's no sustainability there. And if you can't articulate the cost of the conflict with the person that needs the plan, if you don't know what that's costing you in revenue, productivity, customer service, uh, retention, if you don't understand why that problem, how it connects to the bigger mission, vision, goals, values, then it's not going to be that effective. So here's the picture of seems like we need a personal improvement plan. Maybe the conversation should have happened maybe 6 years ago. I was at a conference. I was speaking at a medical conference, and people really liked the presentation. And this was when I was authoring 7 Ways to Stop Drama in Your Healthcare Practice. And someone came up afterwards and said, "Wow, that was so good." She said, "I loved everything you said." She said, "The problem that I have is that I inherited my situation. I inherited a troublemaker." And she proceeded to tell me about the problems. And I said, "Oh, that is really hard when you've inherited it. How long has this been going on?" She said, 12 years. So that tells me that there's a mindset that if you inherit something, that you can't do something after the first month, that you've got to just keep it that way because that's how it was when you got there. This tells me that there's a lack of leadership development and understanding the role of leadership. In order to change the culture, you have to change the conversation. So my 2025 is about changing the conversation and changing the culture. And so in 2025, I'm building, it's already in play right now, but we're finishing out the ecosystem for building a culture of accountability, which is really going to be that system of training, coaching, sustainability, and an online course for retention and practice. My plan is to have that not only for individuals, but for enterprises that want to license. So if you want to get on the list for that, I've got 2 calls to action, which is, I guess, a no-no in the sales world, but you can take the culture avoidance survey and I'll let you know when the online is here. You can also email me. Of course, if you want to talk about it beforehand, we can have a short conversation. I can kind of walk you through the plan. And then again today, if you want to get the learning guide, it's at my website, marlenechism.com/office hours. I'm so glad that you joined me today, and, I didn't really get a lot of scrolling on the comments, so I don't know if that's shut down, but I know some of you are here. I appreciate you being here. Reach out to me, and let's talk about how we can change the conversation in 2025.